The morning sun had barely touched the Chilean mountains when Dr. James Chen heard the first explosion. He looked up from the rare mountain flower he was studying, his botanical research forgotten as two streaks of light raced across the sky. The lights weren't planes. They moved too fast, turned too sharply, and left trails of energy that shouldn't exist on Earth. James watched, mouth open, as the two objects fought. The larger vessel, dark and spiky, fired what looked like purple energy bolts at a smaller, sleeker ship that glowed with soft blue light. The blue ship moved like a dancer, dodging most hits, but it couldn't avoid everything forever. "This can't be real," James whispered, fumbling for his phone to record the battle. His hand shook too much to get a clear shot. Above him, the dark ship finally landed a solid hit. The blue vessel's graceful movement stopped, replaced by an uncontrolled spin. James's eyes widened as he realized the ship was heading straight for the valley below his research site. He grabbed his backpack, which thankfully contained his first aid kit, and started running. The ship crashed less than a mile away, carving a deep trench through the earth and taking down several trees before coming to rest. Common sense told James to run the other way. Whatever this was, a secret military test, an actual alien ship, or something else entirely, it was dangerous. But he couldn't leave someone who might need help. His sister had always said his kind heart would get him killed one day. As he got closer to the crash site, the air felt strange, like static electricity before a storm. The ship's blue glow was fading, and now he could see it clearly. Smooth silver metal with patterns that seemed to flow like water. It was nothing like any aircraft he'd ever seen. A section of the hull split open with a hiss. James ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding. He heard something fall to the ground, followed by a pained grunt. Carefully, he peeked around the rock. His breath caught in his throat. The pilot was humanoid and female, but definitely not human. Her skin had a metallic sheen and was covered in small iridescent scales that shifted color in the morning light. She wore armor that looked like it was grown rather than made, with the same flowing patterns as the ship. A nasty gash on her side leaked silvery blood. The alien warrior tried to stand but collapsed. She pulled out a device that projected holographic symbols in the air, spoke something in a musical language, then threw the device away in frustration when it sparked and died. James knew he should stay hidden, but watching her struggle, clearly injured and alone on a strange world, made his decision for him. He stepped out from behind the boulder, hands raised to show he meant no harm. The warrior's reaction was instant. Despite her injuries, she rolled into a fighting stance and pulled out a weapon that hummed with energy. Her eyes, solid silver with no pupils, fixed on him with predatory focus. "I want to help," James said slowly, keeping his hands visible. He pointed to her wound, then to the medical kit symbol on his backpack. "You're hurt." She said something he couldn't understand, her weapon never wavering. James slowly knelt and opened his backpack, pulling out the first aid kit. The warrior watched every movement, her head tilted slightly like a curious bird. James pulled out some gauze and antiseptic. "Look," he said, miming cleaning a wound and bandaging it. "I can help." Above them, a distant rumble made them both look up. The dark ship was circling back. The warrior's silver eyes darted between James and the sky. She grimaced, clearly struggling with a decision. Finally, she lowered her weapon slightly and gave a short nod. James moved forward carefully, hoping he wasn't making a huge mistake. As he got closer, he noticed her armor was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a faint heartbeat. The warrior watched him with a mix of pain, suspicion, and something else. Maybe surprised that a primitive human would dare approach her. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would change both their worlds forever. The silver-scaled warrior watched James's every move as he cleaned her wound. Her silvery blood made his first aid supplies sizzle slightly, but the bleeding was slowing down. She spoke again in her musical language, softer this time, though James still couldn't understand a word. "I'm James," he said, pointing to himself. Then he gestured to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She seemed to understand. "Kalura," she said, touching her chest. Then she winced as James applied more antiseptic. The sound of engines overhead made them both freeze. The dark ship was getting closer. Kalura tried to stand again, but James gently pushed her back down. "You'll make the bleeding worse," he said, even though she couldn't understand him. He pointed to the thick forest nearby. "We need to hide." Kalura shook her head and reached for her weapon. Her hand was shaking. James noticed her skin had taken on a paler shade, probably from blood loss. She said something that sounded angry, but her voice was weak. Making a quick decision, James packed up his first aid kit and grabbed Kalura's arm. She resisted at first, but another explosion nearby changed her mind. The dark ship was firing at the crashed vessel, methodically destroying it. Together, they stumbled into the forest. James helped Kalura behind a fallen tree just as three figures in black armor dropped from the sky. Their armor looked wrong somehow, with pipes and wires sticking out at odd angles. Through gaps in their suits, James could see glowing cybernetic parts. Kalura cursed under her breath. At least, James assumed it was cursing from her tone. She raised her weapon, but her hands were shaking too much to aim properly. The cyber soldiers started scanning the area with red beams of light. James looked around desperately, then noticed something. The mountain flowers he'd been studying earlier grew all around them. He remembered reading that their pollen could cause severe allergic reactions. Moving slowly, James picked up a thick branch. Kalura watched him with confusion as he carefully stood up, staying behind the tree. The cyber soldiers were getting closer. James swung the branch hard at a cluster of flowers. A cloud of pollen burst into the air, drifting toward their hunters. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the soldiers sneezed. Another started coughing. Soon all three were struggling with their breathing systems. Kalura's eyes widened as she understood what James had done. She took aim with her weapon, her hand steadier now, and fired 3 quick shots. The distracted soldiers fell before they could react. "We need to move," James said, helping Kalura up. "There will be more coming." She nodded, seeming to understand his meaning if not his words. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into a compartment in her armor and pulled out a small device. It looked like a silver marble. She pressed it against James's throat. There was a slight tingling sensation. Then Kalura spoke again. This time, James understood her. "That was impressive," she said, her voice still carrying its musical quality, but now comprehensible. "Using local flora as a weapon. Our combat training never considers such tactics." "It's a translation device?" James asked, touching his throat in wonder. "Yes. Now listen carefully, James of Earth. Those were Void Reavers. They won't stop hunting me." She grabbed his arm, her silver eyes intense. "I need your help. You just proved that sometimes primitive solutions are the most effective. Will you help me survive on your world until my people can find me?" More explosions lit up the sky. The dark ship was still searching. James looked at Kalura, an alien warrior who could probably kill him in seconds, asking for his help. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It was probably going to get him killed. "Yes," he said. "I'll help you." Kalura's scales shifted to a slightly warmer color. James would later learn this was a sign of relief. "Then teach me," she said, "how to survive like a human." Dawn brought danger. James woke to Kalura shaking his shoulder, her scales a dark gray color he hadn't seen before. "Void Reaver Scout," she whispered. 1 kilometer south. Their scanning patterns suggest they've detected something." James quickly packed their supplies, moving quietly as Kalura had taught him. Her wound was healing, but she still wasn't at full strength. When she tried to power up her weapon, it only flickered weakly. "Energy cells are almost drained," she said, frustration clear in her voice. "Without my ship's charging systems, I'm practically defenseless." James peeked out of the cave. In the early morning light, he could just make out a figure moving through the trees below. The Void Reaver's cybernetic parts glinted in the sun. It was heading straight for them. Not defenseless, James said, his mind racing. Just differently armed. Come on. They moved through the forest, staying low. James led them to a steep slope he'd noticed the day before. The ground was still wet from yesterday's rain. What's your plan? Caldera asked, watching the Void Reaver getting closer through the trees. Remember how you said my primitive traps were interesting? James grabbed a thick vine hanging from a tree. Time for a practical demonstration. He quickly explained his idea. Caldera's scales shifted between skeptical purple and impressed blue as she listened. That's either brilliant or insane, she said when he finished. Why not both? James grinned. Ready. They worked fast. James knew from watching the earlier fights that Void Reavers relied heavily on their technology. Scanning systems, energy weapons, and cybernetic enhancements. But those same advantages could become weaknesses. The scout was close now. They could hear its heavy footsteps and the whir of its scanning equipment. Caldera tensed, but James put a hand on her arm. Wait, he whispered. The Void Reaver stepped into the small clearing they'd prepared. Its helmet turned, red scanning beams sweeping the area. It paused, probably detecting their recent presence. James threw a rock. The stone hit a tree far to their right. The Void Reaver spun toward the sound, just as James had hoped. Its heavy cybernetic parts shifted its balance exactly as he predicted. Now, James yanked the vine. The hidden logs they'd positioned rolled down the slope. The Void Reaver turned at the noise, but too late. The muddy ground beneath its feet, which they'd carefully loosened, gave way. The scout's own weight worked against it. Its cybernetic parts, so powerful on solid ground, only made it fall harder. The Void Reaver tumbled down the slope, its scanning systems disrupted by the mud covering its sensors. It crashed into a tree at the bottom with a loud crack. Before it could recover, Caldera was moving. Even injured, she was incredibly fast. She jumped down the slope, and using techniques James had shown her, jammed a thick branch into the scout's main joint where mud had already compromised its servos. The Void Reaver tried to stand but couldn't. Its systems sparked and failed. We should go, James said. That noise might attract others. Caldera quickly stripped the scout of any useful technology, including energy cells for her weapon. As they hurried away, she looked at James with new respect. You defeated an elite Void Reaver scout, she said, with mud, logs, and a vine. No, we defeated it, James corrected. My plan, your execution. In the Dominion, I teach advanced combat techniques to our most promising warriors, Caldera said. But today, a human botanist showed me that I still have much to learn. Her scales shifted to a warm gold color. Perhaps, would you teach me more? James smiled. Only if you teach me too. I think we both have skills the other could use. Agreed. Caldera's scales brightened. Though we should hurry. When this scout doesn't report back, they'll send more. They moved quickly through the forest, now working together with a new understanding. They had just proved that the combination of human ingenuity and alien skill was more powerful than either alone. They would need that combination even more in the days to come. You want me to drink that? Caldera asked, staring at the steaming liquid James had just made from bark and leaves. They had been hiking through the Chilean mountains for 6 hours, putting distance between themselves and the crash site. Caldera's wound was better, but she still needed rest. Now they sat in a small cave as rain poured outside. It's willow bark tea, James explained, holding the makeshift cup made from folded leaves. It's nature's painkiller. Think of it as primitive medicine. Caldera took the cup carefully. Her silver eyes studied the liquid like it might jump out and attack her. In the Nexus Dominion, we have nanobots that repair our bodies. I've never had to rely on plants. Well, your nanobots seem broken right now, James said, pointing to her still healing wound. So maybe give Earth medicine a chance. She sipped the tea and her scales rippled with surprise. It helps, she admitted. The pain is less. James smiled and turned his attention to the cave entrance, where he'd set up simple alarm systems using loose stones and vines. Any movement would cause the stones to fall, warning them of approach. Such basic tools, Calera observed, watching him work, yet effective. In our training, we're taught to rely on energy shields and motion sensors. What happens when those break? James asked. Calera paused, her scales shifting to a darker shade that James was learning meant frustration. We're not trained for that scenario. A warrior of the Dominion is expected to die before letting their technology fail them. Thunder rumbled outside. James added more wood to their small fire, carefully positioned so its light wouldn't be visible from the cave entrance. That's a waste of good warriors, he said softly. Calera was quiet for a long moment. Perhaps, she finally said. Tell me, how did you learn all this? These survival skills. Some from books, some from experience. I spend a lot of time in remote places studying plants. You have to be prepared for when things go wrong. He grinned. Though I'll admit, alien warrior crash lands in mountains wasn't on my list of possible emergencies. Calera's scales flickered with what James now recognized as amusement. Then she stiffened, her hand going to her weapon. Someone's coming. James hadn't heard anything, but he trusted her enhanced senses. Sure enough, moments later, stones clattered at the cave entrance. They pressed themselves against the walls. Calera's weapon ready. A mountain lion padded into the cave, seeking shelter from the rain. It froze when it saw them. Don't shoot, James whispered. If you fire that weapon, the Void Reavers might detect the energy signature. Calera looked at him like he was crazy. Then how do we fight it? Instead of answering, James picked up a burning branch from their fire and waved it at the big cat, shouting. The mountain lion backed away, then turned and ran. Simple tools, James said with a slight smile. Calera shook her head in wonder. In my 100 years of combat experience, I've never. She stopped, seeing James's expression. Ah, I forget humans have shorter lifespans. How old are you? James asked, curious. By your years? About 300. She smiled at his shock. Still quite young for my people. Young enough that my superiors think I have much to learn. Her scales shifted to a thoughtful blue color. Perhaps they're right, just not in the way they think. Outside, the rain began to ease. James checked their supplies. Food harvested from plants he knew were safe, water collected from clean mountain streams, medicinal herbs for Calera's wound. We should rest, he said. Tomorrow we'll need to move again. The Void Reavers won't give up easily. Calera nodded, then said something that surprised him. I'm glad it was you who found me, James of Earth. My people have much to learn from yours. James smiled. Maybe we have things to learn from you too. Neither of them knew they were about to put those lessons to the test much sooner than expected. 3 days after defeating the scout, James and Calera sat in a natural cave behind a waterfall. The rushing water masked their heat signatures from Void Reaver scanners. Calera was quiet, lost in thought as she watched James make rope from plant fibers. Something's bothering you, James said, not looking up from his work. Calera's scales rippled with surprise. How did you know? Your scales have been gray for hours, and you haven't corrected my technique once today. He smiled. Usually you have plenty to say about my primitive methods. I've been thinking about our battle with the scout, Calera said. She pulled out her weapon and studied it. This is the most advanced personal energy weapon in the Nexus Dominion. Yet it was useless without power. Meanwhile, you turned the environment itself into a weapon. James tied off the rope he was making. Different tools for different situations. Your weapon is amazing when it works. That's not. Calera stood up and paced, her scales shifting between frustrated purple and embarrassed green. James, I need to tell you something. In the Dominion, I'm not just any warrior. I'm the combat instructor prime. James raised his eyebrows. That sounds important. I train our most elite warriors. For 100 years, I've taught the same techniques, the same strategies, all based on our advanced technology. She stopped pacing. And now I realize I've been making a terrible mistake. A distant explosion made them both look up. Through the waterfall, they could see Void Reaver ships searching the mountains. What kind of mistake? James asked. We've become too dependent on our technology, too rigid in our thinking. Calera sat down beside James. When you made that tea for my wound, I thought it was primitive. But it worked. When you suggested using mud and logs against the scout, I thought it was crude. But it worked. Everything I dismissed as primitive or basic has proven effective. She reached out and picked up the rope James had made. Our warriors would never think to make their own tools. If their equipment fails, they're trained to keep fighting until they die. We call it honor, but maybe it's just pride. James was quiet for a moment. So what are you going to do about it? Calera's scales shifted to a determined gold color. Something unprecedented. She turned to face James fully. I, Calera, Combat Instructor Prime of the Nexus Dominion, formally request to become your student. James almost dropped the rope he was holding. What? Teach me everything. Not just survival skills, but how you think. How you see problems and find solutions. How you turn disadvantages into advantages. Her silver eyes were intense. When I return to the Dominion, I want to change how we train warriors. We need to learn this human adaptability. Another explosion, closer this time. The Void Reavers were getting better at searching. You really think your people will accept learning from humans? James asked. After I tell them how a human botanist helped defeat multiple Void Reavers with nothing but local materials. Calera's scales flickered with amusement. They'll have to listen. James stood up and offered his hand to Calera. Well then, student, your first lesson starts now. Those explosions are getting closer, so we need to move. Let's see if you can spot 3 different ways we can use this waterfall to cover our escape. Calera took his hand and stood, her scales bright with excitement. My people have a saying. The greatest warrior knows they are always a student. I never truly understood it until now. They packed quickly, both knowing the Void Reavers were closing in. But something had changed between them. The alien warrior and the human botanist have found a new balance, a new way of sharing knowledge that would soon change both their worlds. They just had to survive long enough to make it happen. Night had fallen in the mountains, and James was teaching Calera how to fish with a handmade spear. The small mountain stream provided good cover from Void Reaver scanners, its cold water masking their heat signatures. Patience, James whispered as Calera stabbed at the water again, missing another fish. You're thinking like a warrior, direct, aggressive. Think like a hunter instead. In the Dominion, we don't hunt, Calera said, her scales showing frustration. Our food is synthesized. More efficient, they say. And if the synthesizers break down? Calera's scales darkened. Then we go hungry until they're fixed. She looked at the spear in her hands. Like now, hungry and learning to fish like a primitive, like a human. James noticed her correction. Tell me about your people, he said. You've mentioned the Dominion, but what are they really like? Calera watched the water, trying to copy James's relaxed stance. We were once like humans, living on a single world. Then we discovered quantum drive technology. We spread across thousands of systems, built great cities among the stars. Our technology grew more advanced with each generation. Sounds impressive, James said. It was. Is. Calera's scales shifted to a sad blue color, but something happened. We stopped adapting. Everything became about procedure, about following the most efficient path. Our warriors train the same way they did 500 years ago, because our combat computers say it's optimal. A fish swam close. This time, Calera stayed still, waiting. Her spear moved like lightning, and finally she caught one. "Well done," James said, smiling. Calera studied the fish. "This is why we're losing to the Void Reavers," she said quietly. James looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Void Reavers used to be part of the Dominion. Scientists who believed we could improve ourselves by merging with machines." Her scales rippled with anger. "When the Council refused to let them experiment on our people, they broke away, started taking what they wanted by force. And they're winning." "Yes." Calera put the fish in their cooking pot. "They adapt, change their tactics, create new technologies. While she gestured to herself, we follow the same battle plans, use the same strategies, because that's what our combat computers tell us is best." James added some herbs to the pot. "Computers can't predict everything." "No, they can't predict a human using mud and logs to defeat an elite scout." Calera's scales brightened, or using pollen as a weapon, or hiding under a waterfall to mask heat signatures. A distant rumble made them both look up. Through the trees, they could see Void Reaver ships patrolling with searchlights. "The Void Reavers are hunting me because I'm Combat Instructor Prime," Calera continued. "They think killing me will demoralize our warriors. But maybe," her scales shifted to thoughtful blue, "maybe they're doing me a favor." "How so?" "By showing me a better way. By making me crash on Earth, where I met a human who thinks differently than anyone I've known in 300 years. She looked at James. "Your people are young compared to mine, but you haven't lost your spark. You adapt, create, find new solutions." James stirred the cooking fish. "We have to. We're still figuring things out." "Exactly." Calera's scales turned bright gold. "That's what the Dominion has forgotten. We think we figured everything out, so we stopped looking for new answers." She picked up the handmade spear again. "But the universe always has new challenges. If we don't keep learning, keep adapting, you end up hungry and learning to fish," James suggested with a smile. "Yes," Calera said, her scales showing amusement. "Though perhaps that's exactly what we need." They ate their caught fish as night deepened around them. Above, the Void Reaver ships continued their search, unaware that their quarry was learning lessons that would change the course of an interstellar civilization. And somewhere in the darkness, something was moving closer to their camp. So the shadow that had been stalking their camp turned out to be another Void Reaver scout team. 3 of them this time. James and Calera watched them from the branches of a tall tree, where Calera had insisted they sleep after teaching James how to secure himself safely at height. "Their scanning patterns are different," Calera whispered. "They're learning from their previous failures." James nodded. The Void Reavers moved more carefully now, checking up into trees and testing the ground before each step. Their previous tricks wouldn't work again. "Then we need new tricks," James said quietly. "What do you see?" Calera's scales shifted to a thoughtful blue. She was getting better at this game, combining her tactical knowledge with James's way of viewing the environment as a tool. "The cybernetic parts on their left sides are less protected," she said, "probably to help with heat dispersion. And," her eyes narrowed, "they're staying close to each other. They learn not to get isolated." "Good observations," James smiled. "What else?" "The morning dew is heavy on the leaves. The sun will rise soon, and when it does," Calera's scales brightened with excitement. "James, I have an idea. But I'll need you to trust me." They quickly discussed the plan. James raised his eyebrows a few times but nodded. It was exactly the kind of thinking he'd been trying to teach her, using natural phenomena in unexpected ways. The Void Reavers were directly below them now. Calera pulled out her weapon, now fully charged thanks to the energy cells they'd scavenged. "Ready," she whispered. James grabbed a branch. "Ready." Calera fired 3 quick shots, not at the Void Reavers, but at the morning dew-covered leaves above them. The energy beams instantly turned the water to steam, creating a thick cloud that confused the Reaver's thermal sensors. At the same time, James swung down through the steam cloud, scattering the special paste they'd prepared from local plants across the Reaver's exposed left sides. The paste was harmless in shadow, but when sunlight hit it— "Now!" Caldera shouted. She fired again, this time at a dead tree they'd noticed earlier. It fell exactly as she'd calculated, clearing a path for the rising sun to hit their enemies. The paste reacted to the sunlight, expanding rapidly into a thick, sticky foam that jammed the Reaver's cooling vents. Their cybernetic parts began to overheat almost immediately. The Void Reavers tried to fight, but they were in chaos. Their sensors were still confused by the lingering steam, their movements were hindered by the expanding foam, and their systems were rapidly overheating. One by one, their cybernetic enhancements shut down to prevent catastrophic failure. Caldera dropped from the tree, moving with practiced grace, with swift strikes she'd learned from centuries of combat, enhanced by James's lessons about using terrain effectively. She disabled each Reaver before they could recover. "Clear," she called out. James climbed down more slowly. "You know," he said, "when you first suggested combining your energy weapon with photoreactive tree sap, I thought you were crazy." Caldera's scales showed proud gold colors. "I learned from the best. You taught me to see resources where others see obstacles." She began checking the fallen Reavers for useful technology. The old Caldera would never have thought of this. She would have tried to fight them directly, probably died honorably in the attempt. And the new Caldera? She prefers living cleverly to dying honorably. She found another energy cell and pocketed it. "The Void Reavers aren't just hunting me anymore. Now they're hunting us. But they don't understand what that means." "What does it mean?" Caldera's scales rippled with fierce joy. "It means they're fighting both Dominion combat expertise and human ingenuity. They're not ready for that combination." A sudden burst of static came from one of the fallen Reavers. A voice spoke in a harsh, mechanical language. Caldera's scales paled. "The battle commander," she said. "He's coming personally now." She looked at James with worried silver eyes. "We've angered them. They'll send everything they have." James picked up one of their makeshift weapons. "Then we'll just have to get more creative." The rising sun cast long shadows through the trees as they quickly gathered their supplies. The real battle was about to begin.